Welcome to Chapter 3 of the Game Ready Assets. This is going to be the texturing portion, where we talk about texturing, surfacing, basically making the materials that your objects are made of. Oh god, Blender's having an aneurysm. There we go. So, first thing I'm going to do is set up my area because I hate how this looks. And then I'm going to do a nice vertical split. And here's the big thing. When I texture, I use a lot of area because I tend to go a little nutty. You're looking for... The window you're looking for making textures is your shader editor. This is where you do all your shading. I use this big window because it makes certain things easier to do than having that tiny one at the bottom. And typically the other thing I'll do, because I set this up for texturing and baking, I split this, and then I'll have this be an image editor, because then I can see my images when I go to bake. So this is my normal setup for texturing. And then I have my object up here in render mode. I can usually, because I'm only working with a few objects at a time, I sometimes switch this one to be another 3D viewport that's not set to the full render view, which is that fourth. This is full render view, the fourth option, but the temporary render, so I can see what the object's doing without that render stuff. If I need to edit the object in that way, but right now, keeps things simple. We're gonna keep this in our outliner, so we can switch between objects. So, as I said, when you're making a texture for multiple objects, it's a pretty good idea to start with the most complex of those objects, because generally, if a texture works for a very complex object, it normally will work for a pretty simple one. There are cases where that's not true, but like this wood board, if I make a wood texture that follows and flows with the contours of this, it should flow and follow with the contours of the other ones. So, how do we go about making a wood texture? Wood texturing, what? How do I make wood in a computer without bringing in a sample of wood? It's not that hard. One of the most common, most useful, most basic of texturing tools is the noise texture. If you have, so Node Wrangler, I'm going to talk about Node Wrangler for a second. Everybody should know about Node Wrangler. In Blender, if you go to your preferences and you go to add-ons, every blend file basic should come with, without downloading anything, it should come with Node Wrangler. So if you get Node Wrangler and you enable it, you click that little checkbox. Anytime you're in one of these, Control Shift click, Control Shift left click, and it will automatically pop your selected node into the viewer. Now, you'll notice nothing's changed. And do you know why that is? Because this material is firstly just material, and secondly, isn't attached to anything. So if I click on this board, my thing disappeared because it's showing the texture that's currently enabled in slot 1, and this doesn't have any slot. If you come up here and pick a material, it'll assign it to slot 1. It will make a slot 1 for your object and slot in whatever material you pick to slot 1. The other way to do that, you just add a material slot and then put in your material to that slot. Also, name your materials. Name everything. Everything needs a name. This is going to be wood board. Actually, I'm going to call this rotten wood board because one of the advanced parts of texturing that I want to talk about is adding special details to stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is add just wood grain. And then we're going to add moldy bits. And I'm going to go into texture painting, which is going to be another part of this. Probably not till tomorrow, because texturing, as simple as texturing can get, it takes time. People who understand textures know this. Like, a texture can be super basic. You can understand it inside and out. It will still take you like an hour or two to put together. So, I'm going to name this Rotten Boards. I'm also not going to get into the depths of texture organization, like making subgroups or, what is it? Control T? Oh, that's the other. Wait, I'll show you how to do that. What is it? Control G? Yeah, I'm not going to get into grouping because grouping gets friggin' wild. We'll do texture grouping when I understand it a little better, but there are ways to organize your stuff so it's not so messy. I just have messy textures that I just use because when you make them, you understand them, and when you don't, you just put together what somebody else has shown you. Basically, I'm just going to go over the basics of texturing and get into the finer details of how to copy materials. You can already see, even without, because this is UVs basically, even without adding any extra like dimensions or adding in your mapping node, which by the way, if you have Node Wrangler, or I think it might be default, if you're on a thing and hit Control T, it will add a texture coordinate and a mapping node. Now this is the crucial part. So if I take the object and I map it in here, generated normally works, but I usually take the object in. So now I have complete control because this texture is mapped to this object. Control T pulls up texture and mapping, vector to vector, vector to vector. Put in all these and you will have a texture that is mapped to your object around the edges seamlessly. Now, sometimes that doesn't always work. Sometimes there are certain catches to that. But you can see, if you look at the noise texture, actually let me scale this up. You can see now, like, these colors are flowing around the corner. You can't see the edge there because it's seamless. And if you bake that in, it will still be seamless. I'm going to crank the scale back up. But now we're going to get into the basics of the wood texture. So, now we understand the mapping. If you map it to the UV, if I map it to the UV, it will, of course, have a seam because it's mapping it to that UV image. It'll map it to... Oh, it won't show it. I can pull it up for a second. UV editor. And then, it's mapping it to this. But, go back to image editor. If we map it to the object, there's no seam. It also means any stretching you have to do by hand, but that's okay, because we're going to do that. So, making a wood texture. How do? Well, the first thing we want to do is make this black and white image look a little bit like a wood grain. Well, wood grain normally follows the board, right? Then we need it to stretch along this axis. Well, we can see, since we aligned these, it's along the y-axis. So, come down here to scale, and you just take your y and scale it down, which will expand it along the y-axis, so you have these long streaky bits. You go too far, you end up with basically lines, but you crank it up just a little bit past that, like 1.15, 0.18, 0.2 almost, and you get these long streaks. And those streaks will leave your curvature along the end of the boards looking flat. So you can also get since these boards are lined up and down, like these walls are lined up and down, take your Z and scale it down to like half-ish, 0.5, 0.4, 0.3, and you'll get these. But notice they still match up on both sides and along your holes. They will match up along the seams of the hole. So you have your streaks now. You have your bits and bobs. Now, if we just made this brown, it wouldn't look very good. And that's okay. Because what we're going to do, we're going to zoom in so you can see a little bit of the grain. We're going to take the detail, crank that boy right up. I will say when making game ready assets, I go ham on the detail because when you bake it out into an image, you're going to lose a bunch of that detail. So going higher on here and lowering it here, it works out in the end. If you increase your roughness, you lose a lot of that detail. If you lower your roughness, you get these nice blurry blobs. But go a little bit higher than 0.5, and it takes some of those hard edges out, but it gives you a lot of grain. It gives your wood a lot of grit. And as a touch, we're going to add some distortion, but we're not going to do it like this. Because if we just add distortion, it distorts the whole board. So actually, we will probably add some distortion to the entire board. But we want those little spiral effects. And those spiral effects only happen when you get to high distortion. But distorting the whole board like this, it gives you a little bit of a mess and it takes away those clean lines that we want. So I'm going to show you a technique for getting more distortion in certain areas. Which, guess what? It's going to use another noise texture. Shift A is Shift Add. Same thing as in here we add an object. We're adding a node. Hit search. type noise, and it will bring in a fresh, clean, unaltered noise texture. So the other thing is, when you have when you have a little square like this, the stuff on the right side is your outputs. The stuff on the inside, or the stuff on the left side, is your inputs. Inputs can only have one input. You can only have one thing into one. But outputs can go to like 5 different sources. And because I know we're going to do this, we're going to go ahead and take this noise factor and we're going to plug it into the distortion because that's where it's going to go. But here's a problem. We do this and it doesn't look like much has changed. We crank the scale up, we see some stuff shifting around. But what we need to do is figure out what exactly we're working with noise to figure out where we're putting stuff. So I knew to explain textures a little bit. A texture is color data, right? All of these values, your scale, your detail, your roughness, all that is a number value based on a color. And what that means is white is 1, black is 0, and if you have past white, you can have numbers like 10, 15, 50, whatever. You can scale those up by factorials and stuff. Distortion goes past 1. So if we wanted to mess with it, we would have to, if we want to get to the extreme ends, we have to go past 1. So if you go here, you can see it doesn't really show up that well. If you crank it up, you can see more of the noise texture. Those black spots are closer to 0, the white spots are closer to 1, and it's on a scale. Well, we need to edit that scale and isolate it. So, why is it? Oh, here's another thing. Because we don't want this section to be warped, we want it to be rounded, we can't use this vector. We need a new mapping node. So Shift-A, map, boop, mapping node, same vector, but this one doesn't have the scale warping, which means we plug it right in, and now we have this. No map warping. We technically don't need this, but I like putting it in because it helps with certain things. I like having everything connected to a coordinate. So we're going to take the scale way out and have these wider, clumpier groups. And then we're going to take our detail way down and get these nice blobby groups. And we're going to go ahead and take the roughness out because why not? And then from here, we have a double scale 000 noise texture. We add in a color ramp. And what a color ramp does is it takes in a color value and you can affect it. So if I take this and I crank it right up, see the black's getting blacker and the white's getting thinner? That's because it's basically taking the color data from here and applying that 0 to 1 scale across this bar right here. Let me zoom right in. This bar has a 0 to 1 scale. Down here is 0, up here is 1. And you can see right here the position goes to 1 to 0. So if the color data being fed in is 0 on this and I crank this up, it means basically like here. If the black value is 0.3 or lower, then everything below 0.3 will be solid black. And up here, if I crank this down, everything above 0.7 will be white. And that affects our distortion up here. So if we plug this in, if we crank this up and this down, let's crank this way up. There we go. Then you plug this in, what you're going to end up with, we go back to viewing this, is areas with no distortion and then areas with extreme distortion. And as you can see, those areas with extreme distortion are giving us a lot of that curl pattern. So we want to pick out and select where our curl pattern goes because this is currently most of the board. So what we're going to do is basically just crank this way down, bring this way up, and now we have tiny pockets of white. That's where our distortion is going to be. But here's another issue. Let's pick out. So you slide these up and down. That gives you your determined areas. There we go. Mostly white, mostly dark. And if you look at this, there's going to be a very sharp edge contrast where those edges are. So you fade out the black a little bit. It'll give it a little bit of bleeding distortion that will blend in better. So what you need to do is crank this distortion up even higher and you'll end up with more curvature where you need it. Welcome back. So where I skipped off, I had to pop off for a second. I'm back. We're doing the curvature in the wood texture. This. Outlining the areas that are curvatured. So, as I said, now you can see the splotches. You blend them in a little more, give them a little bit of fade. and it adds slight distortion to those areas, which is good. That's what we want. But I feel like the distortion blends in a little too much, which is what I was going to say before I left. And there's a way to extremize that. And that is math. Yes! I'm bringing math into your 3D modeling. Deal with it. But don't worry. It's not like algebra. It's not extreme. We're just going to multiply. Like I said, white is 1, black is 0. So we can actually multiply those values to get higher extremes. And as long as this fade is correct, we won't see the extreme shift because it'll be shifted. So we need to math. How do we math? Well, you literally Shift A and search for math. Oh God, I've got math in my hand. It burns. But it's okay because I'm going to multiply it. You can set this up to just literally multiply off a set value. But what we're going to do is multiply it by 5. Ugh. Looks a little extreme. So what we're going to do, multiply it by 3. Ah, it looks a little bit better. Maybe we can fade it a little more and pick less spots. So take both of these. Remember, this is personal preference. You just look at what your spots. That doesn't look bad if we just give it a little bit more of a defined edge. Maybe bleed out the selection a little more. And yeah, you got little knots in the wood. That looks pretty friggin' solid if I do say so myself. Not great, not perfect, but you can see, like, just like in knots in wood, it warps around those lines. The other thing we can do that can actually make this look a lot better is that we can add something that's going to change the color of the knots in the wood to make the knots look like real wood knots where they're either darker or lighter. And I'm going to make mine darker. So firstly, those spots are white, so I'm going to use this as my darkening node. I'm just going to take this and I'm going to invert it. Because do you know what that does? Oh look, it makes the white black and the black white. And I want my white to be a little bit more prominent. Yeah, it makes that line a little harsher. But it doesn't look bad. It doesn't. That's the problem. It doesn't look bad. I kind of like it. I kind of like it. So, I've inverted it. Now it's darker. Now, all those spots where the distortion is high will be darker. Yes. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add it to this. So, firstly, box select your crap, move it. Always move your crap because your crap will get in the way of your other crap. And then, I'm going to take this and I'm going to... Yes, I'm going to multiply. Because what this does, when you... Oh, wait, not that. When you multiply a color by a color, what you end up with is... Can I just get what I'm looking for? That's not... Fine, I'll do it this way. Math. Oh, God, I typed it in again. When you do it this way, because you're multiplying... So, when you multiply a value by 1, you just get that value. When you multiply the value by less than 1, you get less than that value. So essentially, in the spots where the wood grain is wood grain, you'll get... Oh, God. Oh, this is add. That's why it's not doing what I want it to. Aha. There you go. Dark spots, light spots. Problem is, this gets rid of all your detail when you do this. And you end up with these big black patches, which when you go to color are going to be big black patches. Or they're going to be big, dark, whatever color patches. And that's not how knots look. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to change this factor right here. We're just going to lower it. And this means the multiplying value is going to decrease your 1 by a little bit, but it's also going to decrease your zeros by a little bit. So you're going to end up with these shadowed spots that will look distorted like knots, but they also won't be unseeable, and you'll be able to see the grain in them. So we'll add some color to this, demultiply it basically, demultiply it, and we'll see where we get a nice balance between the shadow effect, the curvature, and our actual wood grain looking like wood grain. And then with these sliders and everything, when you have a color ramp, you can always go back and play with it. You can always tweak it around and see what values you like to get more or less of an effect. So don't be afraid to play with your stuff until it gets to where you want it to be. So now that I have this, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make another color ramp. Color ramps and noise nodes are basically the king of textures. There's, of course, your Voronoi, your magic stuff. There's a lot of ways to get very interesting, unique textures. But noise is king because noise equals realism in a lot of senses. When you're adding details to make something look more realistic, noise is the way to go. So, let me see if anybody's on the Discord real quick. You can hold for a second. I'll cut this out of the edit. Don't even worry about it. Don't even think about it. Alright. So I have color ramp. This color ramp is important because this color ramp is going to be the color of the wood. But it's black and white. How can it be the color of the wood if it... You change the colors. Boom. Brown. Boom. Lighter brown. You go for a little bit of an orange, and you'll end up with a nice brown. Desaturate it a little bit, you'll get a nice flatter brown. And look at that! So the one thing I notice is that I'm getting too much bleed out. And that's because I'm multiplying this by this, which is taking some of the detail out of my stuff. So it's not as extreme as I want it. If I clamp it, that didn't do anything. Okay. Now I notice the shadows are a little dark, but they are coming out with the little swirly patterns, and that's pretty close to what I wanted. I kind of like it. So we can change up some colors. Just like before, we can shift these around, and it will change how those spots look. The biggest thing I want to do is increase my highlights and actually raise up this color. Oh, this is a color picker. You pick color, pick stuff. You can use HSV codes, RGB, or hexadecimal. You can enter any hexadecimal from like Photoshop or whatever, and you can also color pick and get hex codes and figure out what you want to use. So if you have a reference photo, pull that in and you can literally eyedropper reference it. I'm going to mess around with these values and sliders until I get what I want. And see, the big part of this is going to be a combination of this color ramp and this invert to get where I want it to. And then, of course, messing around with this multiply slider to change the amount of distortion. Because you're probably going to want it like 2 or 3 so you get those nice curves without going crazy. But like... it doesn't look bad at like 6. What about the other spots? You get a lot of grain, but it does give you some curvature in the value. So that's not bad. The other thing, if you just don't like where spots line up, in any texture where you're adding effects like this, like if I don't like this pattern of wood grain, take your location values up here and just slide them around. And all of a sudden, you got a new wood grain pattern. Don't like where these splotches are? Move them. And also, Z will give you a very trippy effect because it's moving through the Z axis. Since this plank is along the X and Y, it just... But yeah, put in random values and you'll get a different pattern. And you can keep doing this until you get one you like. You can go extreme with this and just like crazy values and just see what you get. Like, I kind of like that. I actually want to move it. Yeah, I like that. I also probably want to shrink this a little bit, so I'm probably going to take the scale up so it gets more of a pattern. You can see this is extremely moving my stuff around. That's okay. Yeah. I also want less knots now that I have smaller ones, so I probably want to take the white out a bit and then add in the black to close them up a little bit. Pull the white back. That's a pretty good pattern. Alright. So I've got my little woodboard patterns with my little scrub spots. I can go ahead and adjust this factor to get the kind of multiplying I want. Probably want like a little bit below a 1. And then those darker spots really do look darker. I've got this nice little pattern. Okay. So now we've got this lovely, blended, all over the place sort of texture going. I like it. It's turned out pretty good. But I also see it's not entirely woodish. And actually, so we're going to set up a little bit of a preview. So if you go back to layout, turn on your full render, you'll see a board. But this is because we don't have any real world lighting in. This should actually be dark. I wonder why this is not dark. Did I add a world light? I might have added a world light. Well, that works out, but I'm going to add a light in because I want to add a light in. So if you shift A and go to lights, you can add a light. I'll go into more detail about lighting scenes. We don't typically do this except for testing in something like Blender, because in a real thing, I want to know why I'm getting this weird lighting. Where's this light coming from? Also, why are you not centered on the board? I use cycles because it gives you a better, like, high definition thing. You can use Eevee if you want. Doesn't matter for this. We're just testing and trying to see what lighting looks like. I'm getting a world lighting. Why am I getting world lighting? Did I change the world value? I'm sorry. I just need to fix this for a second. If you go to this, I believe, you can change the color of your background. But it's not taking into account lighting. It's like the lighting is just constant. What happened? What happened? I don't get it. I want to test my lighting to see how lighting affects the board. But now it's not doing that. What did I do? My world texture is fine. It's got the strength and color values right here. This is another place you can change your world color. Is you can do nodes and stuff and fancy stuff in here to change the texture of your world. This is just a flat color. And if I take the strength out of it, yeah, like it straight up just disappears. So how is the board lit in a black room? Where's my lighting coming from? So this is likely in world settings somewhere. I just don't know where. Is it in the texture? Ooh, wait. That might be a thing. Might have happened at some point. Emission. That didn't do it. Code alpha. That's a little bit closer. Actually, if I hide this. Ah, I see. Okay, so it was because I had the view node selected. So when you do this, it shows it even without lighting data. So this gives lighting data so you can see what your lighting does for your board. And there you can see. Okay, let me rotate this boy now. Now that I know what's up, I fixed it. Let me mess with some stuff. So now, you can see the shimmer and the shine and how this board looks like crap. There's not a lot of really like fine detail to this, and there's a reason. Because this is just color data. We need to take this boy and pop it into a normal. So this is another part. Consider this like the next bit of texturing is normal texturing. I'm actually also going to pump this up to like 3. There we go. So this board is very flat, and that's why it's getting that shimmer, and also we need to take the specular out. Don't worry about these values later. I should do a tutorial on all that. I'll go over it after the normal. I will stand by this. You can fight me in the comments. I stand by this. The most important values for any texture, the 2 most important values, are your color and your normal. Now, there are many other values that are very important to making a texture look good. But if you can have a color and a normal, you can ignore a lot of other stuff to get some really good effects with a color and a normal. So, if you come over here and add a normal map, not a normal map, nope, not that. Oh, a bump node, sorry. A bump node, a bump will convert color or height data, aka this black and white data, into actual physical height without adding topology. That is the greatest thing ever. God, look at that grain. Look at that grit. And because I have a sun, you can see the light affecting the grain. Look how gritty that is. Look at those knots. They look so much better now. Oh, that's so good. I actually want to darken them a little bit now because they're not dark enough. Oh, it's so good. So I'm going to crank up the dark on those knots a little bit. I can actually add another color for highlights and stuff inside those knots. Anyway, yeah, it looks a lot better now, and that's just color and normal. It's also very shimmery, but we will fix that. But I would say this looks very gritty, and I want to actually take a little bit of the grit out of this. So how do we do that? Well, we just added a bump node that added all these bumps. So we can change the strength or the distance. Strength will have a very dramatic effect. Oh, geez. Strength will have a very dramatic effect on the grit. You can see the dispersive light as you increase the detail and everything. But you want all the strength because this strength is going to make your render, your bake out, very good. I'm actually loving how these knots turned out. I didn't think they'd turn out this good. There's definitely a very hard edge, which I might go back and fix a little bit. Let me, it just bleeds out. It's very hard to get a nice clean bleed. You could ease. Also, so give it a, oh, there we go. Oh, that's so much better. Yes. Tighten it up. Yes, that's so much better. Okay, so what I just did, changing the blending mode, basically linear interpolation. So it goes from one color to another, and it previously was linear, which means straight from one value to the other in a clean line. Easing basically gives it a curve. So in a background thing you're not seeing, it is curvaturing the drop off between these two. So where there would be the change in the color, you can see it's basically like curving in and out. The other thing I'm going to do, because knots don't typically, like you can see these are dipped into the wood, I'm actually going to take the value before this. I'm going to try this one and see how that looks. Is this better? Give it a second. Recalculating. Every time, so another thing, every time you change a major value in this, it's going to recalculate everything. It's going to reconsider its life. And when it does that, it takes a minute and it freezes and then it comes back. I like this a lot better. So see how it's not dipping into the wood now? It's more flat. It's still got those dark spots, but the wood grain is flatter. It's not like pulling in. And now I'm actually going to take a little bit of the darkness out. I keep changing these values. This is where personal preference comes in. You make stuff look how you want it to look for your thing. And it looks really good like that. I'm actually going to go ahead and add another shade of brown right in the middle and change up its values. Reconsidering life. It's okay. Give it a second. Oh, it's reconsidered. Okay. I'm going to take it down a bit, and then I'm going to make it a little bit more red. Just a touch. And you can see that immediate impact it's having. I can go ahead and... Yeah, see? So there we go. Got some nice grit to the wood. And you can move this around to change it. I might actually... That makes it seem really interesting. I kind of like it. I also go kind of weird with my colors. I'm a weird bastard like that. I like this. So now we've got this. We've got these weird reddish knots in the wood, and I like that. We've got the darker spots for the wood, and then we have the grain and grit. But I got off topic. The strength, it's too gritty. I want to take a little bit out. So I'm not going to change the strength. I'm going to change the distance. So distance has a much less dramatic effect until you get really down low. And then when you get there, you start seeing all the little details start to vanish a little bit. And it starts to look a little bit more like a cut board. Because a cut board isn't going to be super gritty. It's going to have a little bit of smoothness to it because it was cut, you see? And now we've got those little micro details. And I like it. That's more like what I was going for. But also, I don't want it to be this shimmery. This is too much shimmer. So now we get into those other values that make a big difference for textures. The two next most important values, just below your color and your normal, is going to be your specular and roughness. Because if I crank the specular, oh god, it shines. If I crank the roughness, and all that shine disappears. Because now it's being scattered. Roughness is the scattering of light. Specular is the reflection of light. So, with no specular and no roughness, it looks very flat. Add a little bit of specular, and you get a few little points of light, just enough. Add a little bit more, and it's not really changing much. And that's because the light is getting bounced around into individual spots because there's no roughness. So if we keep our specular low like 0.12, because that's about where it should be for like wood, and then you bring in just a little bit of roughness, oh, you get those shimmers back. But those shimmers are bad. Wood doesn't shimmer like that unless it's polished and cleaned and oiled and stuff. This is boards for a sawmill. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to take the roughness and we're going to scoot it way up. 0.5, 0.6, probably about a 0.6. And now you start seeing the light scatter in a big cone pattern because now it's scattering amongst the board. Now you're seeing the light reflect on that grit, but it's not reflecting like a smooth floor. It's reflecting like it's in a rough floor, like rough wood boards. That's kind of what we want. But we can take this one step further. What if you want the knots to be rougher than the rest of the board? Well, we have a perfectly beautiful set of values right here that describe it. We have an even better set of values right here that show the board, the knots, being less or being lower value. So if you plug this in, it will actually make the boards much less rough, or it'll make the knot points much less rough. Yeah, basically down to a 0, and then you get those point effects again. So what do? Oh, well, we have a nice little invert node. Why don't we use that over here? Bloop! Invert, and all of a sudden, my blender is crying. So now, what you end up with is the knots at basically a 1, where the light is scattered so finally you don't even see it, and then across the rest of the board, it's like a middle ground. But maybe that's not what we want. Maybe we want to fix that. Maybe the invert isn't the perfect option. Maybe we just need another one of these. Color ramp! Color ramps are king. I'm telling you, color ramps do everything. Color ramps are perfect for modifying values across the board. Anyway, we're going to take this now, and you can see, oh no, it's all those points again. That's because we have most of the board set to black. So what do? We take all that out. Oh, we get a smoothness now. So remember, it's modifying this image. So this is the value that's being fed into this color ramp. The darker areas are going to be at the darker end of this. The whiter areas are going to be at the whiter end of this. We want those knots to be a little less shiny and the board to be a little more shiny. So we keep this the way it is and we change the colors on this. Basically, instead of changing our positions, we can change what the minimum and maximum of this slider is. And also, we can use linear interpolation for this. And then if we need to, we can change it after the fact. So we let it cry for a second. Blender's going to recover. Yep, there you go. And then these become our black and white values. These become our values. This black and white scale becomes our minimum and maximum. So you can see, in HSV, it's the V. The V is your brightness value. And that becomes your input for the roughness. So at the lower end where these dots are, let's set it to something like, we want this to be extremely rough to scatter light more. So why don't we set it to something like 0.8? And then at this high end where we want light to be scattered less, we want that more of that like smooth board effect, set it like 0.4. Or we can crank it up like 0.6, 0.5 almost. Yeah, there we go. So now the knots are like basically canceling out lighting aspects, and the roughness is scattering light across the whole board. I like this. I like the knotted wood effect. It looks, I really like this. This doesn't look bad. This doesn't look bad. But I'm going to do one more thing. One more thing. We're going to add some mossy, nasty looking little touches to make these boards even more lively. Now, we're not going to do this dynamically. We're going to do this in a painted fashion, which is why I'm going to save it for the next section. I'm going to finish up my texturing here, but I'm going to go ahead and show you this pattern working on the other boards and how you can make it so that these values that you input, so if I pull in if we leave this board up, if I pull in the V-split and I do that, I now have to add my material. Let me try this one more time. So right now, look at the pattern. You see the pattern on the board. If I change boards, oh hey, the pattern's not changing that much. Why would... Oh, get out of here. The curved board screwed me up. If you see, the pattern on these boards is almost the exact same because these boards share a spatial position. So these moved values don't affect it. There is one interesting thing, because if I come into here, come into edit mode on one of your boards and select it, and then you move it, the texture will move because it is recalculating in real time the position versus the... So this object position is based on the position of your object versus its origin, which is the little orange dot in the middle of all these boards. When you grab it and move it, you're moving it relative to the origin, so you're moving it relative to the texture, so it changes. That is one way to diversify these. If I just took this board and scooted it to the side, I'd change the pattern. But I want to change that pattern without moving the board because I want the board here for when I use it for other things, right? Well, why don't I hide my original board split? I need to change the pattern without changing the pattern. How do I change the pattern without changing the pattern? Well, I copy the pattern. So, we have our rotten boards. If you come right up here, there's a little icon, new material, add a new material. I could do that and then just copy all this into that, but why do that when I can do this? If I click on this, I make a single user copy. If I click it, woodboards dot 001. I'm going to change that real quick and make it woodboards underscore split. I'll say VS. No, VSplit. VSplit. Remember, name your stuff sensibly. Don't be like me. VSplit. Now, I'm going to change these values. But notice, I have two. So this, I can now underscore iSplit. So it matches the board because that makes sense. If I go and change this one now, it doesn't affect the other one. So I can take these values. Oh, not that value. Oh, not that value. Not that value. This value. I can change my grain. I can change my position of my spots until I find one I like. No. No. Ooh, I almost like it. I almost like it. I like it. There we go. So now. Also, if you grab these and not in edit mode, if you just move them, they don't change. Because they are moving with their origin, which is what that object center is based on. So there's that. But now, ta-da! I have a new pattern. I have the other board. And if I move it to the side now, they're different patterns. They're not the same pattern. And then, of course, I could change the values for this boy. But the curved board is already a different pattern because it's slightly up from its origin. And yeah, it looks good enough. So I'm going to leave it like that. But now we have textures for our boards, and it works for all three. Also, the important thing to remember is on this curved boy, notice the rendered pattern is straight across because its UV is what's curved. So if on this we do our little copy pattern, we boop, make a copy of the original, and then we just change this to no longer be iSplit but be curved. Now you have the curved pattern. Let's see what happens when we change this to UV. Oh no, I changed the wrong thing. Oh no. If we change this to be curved and then we go to our iSplit board. Give it a second, it's recalculating life. Oh no, look, it's all messed up because the UV is what's curved. But I want to point out, see the bend? The texture is bent. So you can do that. You just got to recalculate all this stuff to fit the UV modeling method. And also, your seams in this will come up as seams. So see across that corner it doesn't match up? Yeah, that happens. But I'm not going to do that because I hate that. So I'm going to just back. Oh, recalculating life. Oh, God. It's going to give itself a hemorrhage. Oh, did it fix? So if I click on this iSplit, if I go to my iSplit board, it is iSplit. Okay, good. Everything's fixed. We'll just... Yep. Oh. Boop. There's our iSplit board, all fixed, all working. So yeah. One second. Boo. There you go. Back, new pattern. Okay. Everything's back to where it was. Textures are good. So in the next one, I'm going to show a little bit of texture painting, which is another method of doing textures like this. And I'm going to do it to show you how to paint on moss. So look forward to that. Have fun. Goodbye.